Because Cedar Point is home to some of the best rides out there, it's no wonder that Cedar Point can get extremely packed and is very popular. And because of that, when you visit Cedar Point, you need a distinct game plan on how you're going to tackle your day at the park. So in this video, I'm going to share with you everything you need to know about Cedar Point so you can seize your day while you're at America's roller coaster. Let's get started. So the first question you're probably wondering is, when should you visit Cedar Point? Well, since Cedar Point can get extremely crowded, avoid weekends at all costs, especially since weekends for any amusement park are gonna be the most crowded days of the week, and you just don't want to visit Cedar Point on weekends. Now, I personally have never visited Cedar Point on weekends, but I have visited during the week, and the major rides like Steel Vengeance, Maverick, and Millennium Force can still reach 90-minute waits on the weekdays. So just imagine on the weekends, they can probably hit like 2 to 3 hour waits, which is just insane. And I know nobody would really want to wait that long for any of these rides. Personally, I wouldn't wait over an hour for any of the rides at Cedar Point, but that's just me. Also, in my opinion, I feel like the best times to visit Cedar Point are late May, before school gets out, and after Labor Day, when all the kids go back to school. Now, I personally don't have experience visiting Cedar Point during this time. I've only visited during the summer months, but because students are still in school at these times, I have a very good feeling the park won't be nearly as crowded as it would be during the summer. So how many days do you need at Cedar Point? Now, from my experience, it is definitely possible to get everything you want to get done at Cedar Point in one day, but I highly recommend to not rush yourself like I do, and I highly recommend to at least spend 2 days at Cedar Point, maybe even three. And that's just because Cedar Point has a ton to do, and especially if you don't want to rush yourself, 2 days at the park is probably the sweet spot. You might even need 3 days, depending on everything you want to do, and especially if you also want to do the water park or hang out by the beach. If you want to do those things, then yeah, you'll definitely need 3 days, but honestly, 2 days is probably the sweet spot at Cedar Point. So when should you arrive at Cedar Point? Now, Cedar Point always opens at 10 a.m. and closes at either 8 or 10 p.m., depending on the day that you visit. And if you visit early or late in the season, like I recommended before, like early May or like after Labor Day, the park will likely close at 8. Now, if you visit during the summer months, so June, July, and August, the park will typically close at 10. And honestly, with Cedar Point, get to the park an hour in advance. That's basically true with every park, and with Cedar Point, it's no exception. Honestly, with Cedar Point, you might even want to get to the park an hour and a half before the park opens, just depending on crowds, so you can get a parking spot. So at Cedar Point, you have two different parking lots. You have the one at the front gate near Gatekeeper, and then you have the other parking lot near their water park, Cedar Point Shores. And honestly, if you can, I would probably recommend driving around the park and parking next to Cedar Point Shores, especially since then you'll be closer to the major rides like Steel Vengeance and Maverick. So then you can potentially get on those a little bit early and the wait won't be as bad. So now let's discuss some parking information regarding Cedar Point. Now, general parking at Cedar Point costs $30 and preferred parking costs $40. Now, personally, I don't recommend going for preferred parking just because the parking lot at Cedar Point is literally right next to the front gate, so you really won't have to walk far at all to reach the front gate. So, because of that, preferred parking is pretty much useless in my opinion. And also, another thing to keep in mind is when visiting Cedar Point, I personally recommend picking up the Fun Day ticket, which includes free general parking on top of regular admission, and it also includes dining, which that will be discussed later on in the video. Now, the next question you're probably wondering is Cedar Point's skip the line system, fast lane, worth it? Now, in my opinion, I'd say no, just because Fastlane, the regular tier, costs $95, and Fastlane Plus costs $120. Now, the difference between the two is Fastlane Plus includes Steel Vengeance, Maverick, Millennium Force, and Valraven, and the regular Fastlane does not include those rides. So if you're gonna buy Fastlane, you need Fastlane Plus because Steel Vengeance, Millennium Force, and Maverick get the longest lines in the park. Also, you do have single-use Fastlane available. So with this, you just go up to the ride's entrance. There's like a kiosk for Fastlane, and you can purchase single shots for individual rides. Now, I'm not sure the pricing on these, but it's probably anywhere between $5 to $15. But don't quote me on that. I'm not fully sure on how much they cost. And personally, I don't recommend Fastlane just because the regular Fastlane is $95 and Cedar Point tickets, like if you want 2 days, that will cost you around $60. So you're spending like an extra $30 for basically not guaranteeing that you're gonna get on any of the rides. So personally, I just recommend spending a second day because you're probably going to have more time to get on the rides than you would have with Fastlane. And especially with Fastlane Plus, because even though you can technically skip the lines, you're still going to have to wait a while. Like, I've seen Steel Vengeance, Millennium Force, and Mavericks Fastlane lines reach over an hour wait. So just because of that, I don't recommend Fastlane. You're just much better off buying a second day ticket for the park. So now one awesome benefit that Cedar Point offers is early entry. Now, to get early entry, you need to either stay at one of the park's hotels, which they got plenty of them to offer. And then you can also have your boat docked at the marina and enter through the marina gate, or if you have a gold or prestige pass with the all park passport for 2024 and beyond, then you can get early entry into Cedar Point. Now, the early entry will only be an hour, but that should give you plenty of time to get on the major rides like Steel Vengeance, Maverick, and Millennium Force with little wait. I mean, you're still probably gonna have to wait like 30 minutes just because of the popularity of those rides, but considering the typical waits can average like an hour, it's definitely worth it if you're willing to spend the extra money on one of Cedar Point's hotels, which let me tell you, I don't know the exact prices, but from my research, Cedar Point's hotels in the summer can cost you around $600 to $1,000 per night. So just keep that in mind if you're planning on visiting Cedar Point. It may or may not be worth it to you to stay at one of their hotels. So now we're at the most important question regarding Cedar Point, and that's what order you should ride the rides in. Now, I didn't include every single main coaster at Cedar Point just because we'd be here forever, but I just included, in my opinion, the major rides at Cedar Point. And personally, I will always recommend start off, head straight to the back of the park, and hit up Steel Vengeance and Maverick first. These are easily the two most popular rides in the park, and by extension, they're the two best rides in the park. So they're obviously gonna get the longest wait at Cedar Point. Even despite them being all the way in the back of the park, they're still gonna have a long wait, but at least you got them knocked out. And then I'd recommend hitting up Millennium Force while you're at it too, which that ride is a decent bit further away, but you'll have plenty of time. And by the time you reach Millennium Force, it will have built up a decent wait, but it shouldn't have been terrible. Just know if you're visiting Cedar Point, even on a weekday, the major rides are still probably going to have hour waits. It's just something you have to deal with, and that's why I recommend at least 2 days at Cedar Point. So after you hit Maverick, you might as well just hit up rides like Cedar Creek Mine Ride and Iron Dragon 2. If they have a short wait, I say do them, but if they don't and have built up a longer wait than like 30 minutes, just skip those rides and just go straight to Millennium Force. And then after that, assuming that it's open, because Top Thrill 2 has been closed pretty much ever since it opened. Like, it only opened for like, I think like 4 or 5 days, and then it's been shut down for like the past 3 to 4 months. But assuming that you're going like next year and it's open, then after Millennium, I highly recommend hitting Top Thrill 2. You might want to hit Top Thrill 2 first, just because like we still aren't sure of how reliable it's gonna be. I mean, I hope it's more reliable than Dragster ever was, but considering the downtime it's been having recently, that is still yet to be known. So honestly, I highly recommend hitting Top Thrill 2 after Millennium Force, but if you're going in 2025, it might be a smart idea to hit Top Thrill 2 first and kind of reverse this order. So then hit like Top Thrill 2, then Millennium, then Maverick and Steel Vengeance. But it's really up to you and the crowds at the park. And then after you hit Top Thrill 2, I then recommend hitting up Gemini, which is literally right next door. And now personally, I do think Gemini is a pretty fun ride, but if it hits an hour wait, honestly, I don't think it's worth it then. But if it has like a 30 to 45-minute wait, I say do it. And then after Gemini, because you're going to be very close to Valraven, I say then hit Valraven next. Now, Valraven, like the other rides I've mentioned so far at Cedar Point, they'll probably have anywhere between a 30-minute to an hour wait. Now, to some of y'all, it might not seem like a dive coaster is worth that wait, and for you, I'd recommend skipping Valraven, but for anybody else who wants to do it, I say go for it, especially if it has like a 30 to 45-minute wait. I say ride Valraven. And then after Valraven, I highly recommend heading next towards Magnum XL 200, the park's hypercoaster. And this ride, it will be a bit of a walk from Valraven, but it shouldn't be too far. And by now, it should probably be like have like a 30-minute to hour wait somewhere in there, like the rest of the rides at Cedar Point. And considering its age, it's not the most comfortable ride, but it still is pretty fun, and those final airtime hills can be pretty powerful. I recommend hitting Magnum XL 200, especially if it has like a 30-minute wait. It's totally worth it. Then after Magnum, I highly recommend hitting Raptor next, which is the park's B&M Invert coaster, and this ride will probably have a solid 30 to 45-minute wait by now, especially since it's a pretty darn high capacity ride. So it shouldn't have as bad of a wait as other rides at Cedar Point. And Raptor's a ton of fun, so I highly recommend doing it. And then after Raptor, honestly, next I'd probably recommend heading over to the boardwalk section and heading to their Wild Mouse. Though that is a pretty simple family coaster. Though it's a pretty fun spinning Wild Mouse, it's definitely on the shorter side, but it's definitely a fun ride. And if you're visiting with like your family or you just have nothing better to do like I did, honestly, I highly recommend riding Wild Mouse, especially if it only has like a 30-minute wait, then it's totally worth it. Now, I've seen it get up to an hour wait, and at that point, it's not really worth it. But then after Wild Mouse, I highly recommend heading over back to the front of the park and hitting up Gatekeeper. Now, Gatekeeper, like Raptor beforehand, typically has a solid 45-minute wait on average, though I have seen it get up to an hour wait on my most recent visit too. And I personally have some recommendations for riding Gatekeeper. Now, if you can, I highly recommend avoiding the outside seat because the outside seat is rather shaky and will give you a headache, which you won't get on the inside seats on Gatekeeper. So keep that in mind when you're going to ride Gatekeeper. So next you're probably wondering is the dining plan at Cedar Point worth it? Now, in my opinion, yes, because if you take my advice earlier and buy the fun day ticket, that includes the dining plan on top of admission and parking. So if you buy the fun day ticket when you visit Cedar Point, dining plan, since it's included, it's 100% worth it. And the dining plan, regular dining, costs $34, and then the all day dining premium, which the difference is that the all day dining premium includes a souvenir cup. Now that's an extra $46. And honestly, that is definitely worth it, especially considering if you were to buy those two separately, the all day dining premium will probably cost about the same as buying all day dining plus the souvenir cup separately. So might as well go all day dining premium unless the fun day ticket is available. Then I highly recommend just going with that since it includes dining. And as for Cedar Point's food, it's actually pretty good. Like, Cedar Point has greatly improved their food offering since I last visited in 2019. And since my visit most recently, like literally like 2 weeks ago, the park's food is actually pretty darn good. Like, I ate at I forgot what restaurant it was, but it was a restaurant in Frontier Town, and then also their newest restaurant at the boardwalk. And both the times I ate there, their food is actually pretty good. Now, personally, I only had like chicken tenders and fries just because the thing is with the dining plan is you can only get one meal every hour and a half. Now, this isn't an issue if you're just visiting with like one person, but if you're like me and only one person has the fun day ticket and you're visiting as a family, then you're going to want to keep that in mind as like the only stuff that's really reasonable to like split is like chicken tenders and fries. That's why that's really all I had at Cedar Point. And from my experience, their food is actually pretty good. Also, my parents had the chicken tenders and smashed potatoes, and now I never saw them and tasted them, but from what my parents said, they said the food was pretty good. So, Cedar Point's food is pretty good, and if you want a comparison, if you've been to like Busch Gardens Tampa, Busch Gardens Williamsburg, SeaWorld Orlando, really any of the SeaWorld parks, the food is about on par with what you'll get at the SeaWorld parks, at least from my experience. So, I personally recommend picking up the dining plan at Cedar Point. And if you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you check out my video on why Cedar Point's overrated, because even though I love this park, I do think it has some flaws, which I do point out in that video. And if you want more from Southeastern Thrills, I recommend you subscribe and hit that notification bell, and peace.